afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Urban Living webinar of 2023. And today we are going to be speaking about flexible living, the future for apartment buildings, a very topical subject. My name's George Sell. I'm editor-in-chief here at IHM and editor of Urban Living News, and we are a multimedia platform for the broader living sector. Today's webinar is going to last around an hour. We'd like to make it as interactive as we can, so if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them either using the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom, and a recording of the session will be sent to everyone who has registered via email. Now, this webinar series is sponsored by IMS, and we are going to see a short video to find out a bit more about them. So thanks very much to IMS for sponsoring. You can find their contact details in the chat if you'd like to get in touch with them and find out more. There's actually going to be quite a bit of information posted in the chat today. So when we get to the end of the session at 3 o'clock, we're going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes just so you can take some notes and copy the various information that you need from the chat down. So we're going to crack on with our conversation. I'd just like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves in turn, and we'll go from left to right as we see them on the screen. So James, would you like to go first? Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me on. Yes, I'm James Pargeter. I'm a senior advisor at Global Apartment Advisors. We're a specialist consultancy and advisors to the purpose-built rental sector, which is primarily built to rent, but also features student living, co-living, that sort of thing as well. Excuse my cough is the other thing to say. Before that, my background, I've been in housing a very long time, delivering all tenures of housing, but have, including a period of leading the residential projects team at Deloitte Real Estate. But in the last 10 years or so, I've been involved in the build-to-rent sector and its growth.
Great stuff. Thanks, James. Good to have you here. And next, Thomas, welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Thomas Bush. I'm the Sales and Marketing Director for AXO Student Living, which is a UK-based student accommodation kind of owner-operator, managing just over 1,800 beds in London, Ipswich, Coventry and Sunderland. Prior to working for AXO, I worked for Liberty Living and Campus Living Villages. I've had circa 10 years in the student accommodation industry.
Thanks, Tom. And John, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, George. Good afternoon, all. My name is John Harrington. I work as the head of real estate for Butler, Mura Living. My role is primarily to source new acquisitions across the board for both of the entities that we have. Butler would be long leases and Mura Living would be buildings for buy to rent. Prior to that, I've just recently joined the company. I came over from a housing association known as A2 Dominion, and I was on the commercial side as one of the senior sales managers for the group, and we were named as Pargeter, which basically is a selling of PD apartments, shared ownership apartments, in order to raise funds for our housing association sector of the business. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, John. And finally, Marcus, good afternoon to you, or good morning for you, I should say.
Good morning from Florida. Thanks for having me here. My name is Marcus from Hostaway. Hostaway is a software for vacation rental property managers, which is a term that has been broadened substantially in the last couple of years. So we serve, we provide software for managing the operations for over 100,000 properties worldwide. Although a large part of the customer base is in the US, we have a strong team and presence in the European markets as well. And that includes everything from vacation rentals to apart hotels, corporate rentals, and we even have hundreds of hotels using our platform. But that's a very small share of our business.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Marcus. So before we get stuck into the conversation, I just wanted to show a couple of slides with some context to frame our conversation today. Flexible and hybrid are two words which are being used a lot around the accommodation and hospitality sectors. And these are some stories that we've run on our Urban Living News website in recent months. So top left, we've got Greystar launching a new hybrid brand, BTR, which takes some of the good elements of co-living and build to rent and puts them together. AXO partnering with Lavender to drive a flexible strategy, which we'll hear more about from Tom during the conversation. And then this top right story was an interesting one. This is a completed asset in Brooklyn, and it was on the market and described as a flexible asset because it could, without very little being done to it, it could be used for co-living, it could be used for build to rent, it could be used for student accommodation. So it's a building which was actually designed with flexibility in mind from the ground up. And on the next slide, a couple of things here that kind of touch on how some of the operational skills the same operational skills can be applied across various asset classes. So we've got Native Group, which was an apart hotel, which is an apart hotel company, is now also a build to rent operator and actually has a bigger BTR pipeline than it does for apart hotels. Flying Butler, again, we'll hear more from John, but a service department operator, which is just moving into the build to rent space now with a new brand. And then the last screen grab is there because towards the end of the chat today, I just want to touch on how the way people work is affecting the need for accommodation to be flexible, because quite a lot has changed since the start of the pandemic. So let's kick off our chat. If you've got any questions, as I say, please do post them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get around to talking about them. So I think flexible living is a term that I first heard in relation to the lease up period in build to rent or student accommodation. And this is where, obviously, if you've got 200 or 300 or even more units to rent out on a long-term basis, that takes a fair period of time, but you don't want the building sitting empty. James, could you just give us a quick overview of how this whole lease up thing started and how it works?
Yes, I mean, you're right. Build to rent or any purpose-built rentals type of development is dependent upon getting to that initial lease-up point as early as possible. So that's why, in development terms, we're keen. The sector is keen to get planning permissions. It's keen to get stuff under construction. It's keen to get it open as quickly as possible. And although it does take a while to lease up a building, it's a lot quicker than the alternative if it was built for sale. Having said that, you probably have pre-sold those apartments to a certain stage before you even started construction. So there are those balances. But I suppose once you've started that lease-up process, you do really want to get the building is there, it's complete. The amenities are there, the management team is there in situ, and you do want to get people living there and building that community as quickly as you possibly can. So having some flexibility around these things, obviously some people will come in with an intention to stay there for a long time, but some people may just simply need a short-term place to be, and that's a good way of bringing people into the building, as long as it's well managed. And obviously, the part of the discussion today is going to be about how that is managed in practice. But that's the kind of the driving factor behind it. And looking further ahead is to whether that can become a component of the long-term leasing environment for that asset.
And this extra business that comes in the lease up period, the short stay business, who would it typically be that's coming to take advantage of that? Is it kind of hotel type guests who might be there only for a couple of nights, or is it slightly longer term than that typically?
I think typically it would be longer term than that, and I'm struggling to remember the minimum length of term that would be considered by the management team there. But you'd be looking at sort of and you've also got to look at your sort of planning conditions and the environment in which you're opening that. But there's a typical sort of 90-day rule. So we're talking about certainly sub three month tenancies, and we may be into sort of 1 month or even a couple of weeks. But that will suit a variety of people who are using it, perhaps as an alternative to a hotel if they're there for a sort of extended period of time. It's whether it's business or otherwise. But it certainly is responding to a demand that is there, and that's the key.
Yeah, thanks, James. John, you're in quite an interesting situation because you're a service department operator and you're moving into the build to rent space, but you're going to incorporate both uses in the same buildings.
That's correct.
During your lease up period, would you have a bigger percentage of the inventory given over to service departments, and would that get smaller in time as you get more BTR tenants coming on board? How do you think that's going to work?
Well, not quite. We sort of have a guideline of somewhere between 80 and 20, 80% BTR, and then 20% would go to the service departments. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty in upscaling it, from a BTR or upscaling it from a service department to a BTR would be that we try and keep the floors separate. So in this particular case, we have in the one that we're currently doing right now, we have 2 of the top floors dedicated to service apartments, and the balance of the apartments are to the BTR. We're very fortunate in the fact that we are getting a quick uptake on the BTR section and a fairly quick uptake on the SOA section. But we would certainly keep them apart. That's one of the ways we would work this. And we would tend to find that by the end of the given period that we've set aside, whether it be 6 to 8 weeks or even up to 12 weeks, we would find that the service department operators would come in quicker, as you well know, into the operation and hit capacity. But for stability of income and so forth, as we discussed with our landlords and the likes thereof, we would always keep the stable income at 80%. That's a model that works for us. And then the higher income or generated income at 20%. But should the service department's operation work in our favor, we could well go back to the landlord and say we'd need to increase that in order to bring up the level of income, which it's proven to be doing at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, John. Tom, student accommodation operators have also adopted this kind of alternate business model during the lease up period, but obviously it's a slightly different process from a build to rent building because the academic year is quite fixed in its parameters. So you need to try and fill a building by a certain time. Can you just talk us through how the lease up thing works in a typical large PBSA asset?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard really to comment on the lease up side of things because up to now, AXO have been purely acquisition led when it comes to the kind of their portfolio expansion rather than developing their own PBSAs from scratch. So we've already taken over schemes with the student population already in place. As you kind of mentioned, like student accommodation generally has pretty strict, it does have strict permissions around allowing non-students to stay, which allows for just a small percentage of that in the kind of given year. And of those students, they need to be considered full-time. So kind of in line with that, courses lasting usually at least 1 semester in the UK. Therefore, our predominant customer has to always be full-time students with a long-term or short stay. And traditionally offering short stays is usually more of a reactive approach, as it would be in a kind of lease up to get you up to a certain scratch. But to talk about it in the kind of once things are underway, it's more reactive once you realise there may be voids closer to the academic year beginning. And in buildings where we know we can fill with longer terms, i.e. more prominent markets, then we'll of course look to do this. However, AXO, like many student accommodations, do have our kind of less buoyant markets. And yeah, kind of for that reason, we have an expectation and a forecast that voids will be there year round. And moreover, since COVID, flexibility has been recognised as a kind of key demand from our students. Not really that the course lengths are kind of changing really, but a lot were caught out over COVID. So, you know, they may have booked 43 or 51-week contracts, but once they arrived and lockdown may have occurred, obviously they didn't have a need for those contracts anymore and found it very difficult to get out of it, basically. So to have a kind of pay-as-you-go package where they can be less committed to a contract and have more digestible payments is kind of an appeal to them. When I say digestible payments, international students having usually not having a UK-based guarantors would often have to pay a lot of or all of their fees up front or their rent up front. So this way it kind of just portions it out for them. So as I say, AXO, with one of our challenge properties, we actually offer year-round flexibility for a certain percentage of our stock, which we don't expect to see full year contracts basically exceed into. And this allows us to advertise all year as almost kind of a student hotel product, which gives us the advantage, I think, over those who are more reactive, where we can kind of advertise year round, kind of get that brand awareness out there and even bank some leads, whereas others will obviously be doing that later in the day. I should mention we don't have the resource to do as frequent turnarounds as, say, a hotel, both administratively and operationally. So we ourselves offer a 29-day minimum with a room-only product. However, as you mentioned before, working with Lavanda enables us to offer kind of a more hotel by means of turnarounds and inclusions, which kind of does give that, I suppose, true hotel experience, though this usually isn't necessary in most kind of buildings until the summer period. But as you say, on that note, outside of term time, we open up the building to the wider population, which means we can target wider markets, of course, which offers like a budget city centre service department experience, basically.
Yeah. So who would be staying in your properties over that summer period when the students aren't there and you kind of offer this hotel model?
Well, it can be anyone, really. Realistically, it depends on the building. Some kind of buildings do have strict covenants to only take students across that like the whole academic year and beyond the academic year, which means we have to only market and take those short-term stays from, again, those full-time students. But yeah, in certain buildings, and most of our buildings, to be fair, we can really expand that to who we wish, really. That it can be a mixture of different demographics, from the students themselves who stay with us extended throughout the summer, some who are staying in other buildings who can't extend their stay, so come to us instead. You can have language schools coming into the UK for courses over the summer. And then, of course, you have kind of that wider population as well, who you can open it up to and do a kind of, as I say, more hotel package.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tom. One of the ways that you can apply the word flexible is to give a building owner or a building operator more flexibility in the type of customers they can attract. Marcus, as you said, your client base is predominantly in the short-term rentals space, which has predominantly been for vacation leisure travelers. But I did notice this morning that you've teamed up with Amadeus to try and broaden that base out more to business travelers. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that will work? And is that limited to a certain number and type of properties, or is that broadly across the offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So GDS provided by Amadeus to us is a system to make bookings on a larger volume, and typically our customers range from one property to tens of thousands of properties, but usually you would not be interested in this unless you're doing corporate travel or corporate stays, or if you have thousands of properties. There's a lot of manual work involved. But the use case here for business travel is that business travel has changed really a lot in the last 2 years. And one of the reasons is that if you want to meet your clients, no matter what type of business you run, you can't just go there. My wife, for example, she used to go to Silicon Valley all the time because that's where her clients are. Unfortunately, those people that she needs to meet, they're now sitting in Colorado, they're sitting in Miami, they're sitting everywhere else. She can go to the office, but she can't actually visit anyone because nobody works in the office. However, this increases the importance for events and for employee building type of events. I remember back in 2015, I was working in a company in Finland, and we took the entire office to Greece for a month, which was, it got a lot of press. Even people said, I want to work there. And now what we're seeing is that's just the norm. But what you need in order to enable that is, of course, a big inventory of properties, and you need to make sure that they can be worked in. So having access to comfortable working situations or spots, and having good Wi-Fi connection, having all the basics in place. I mean, if you rent a cottage, sometimes there's no warm water, the electricity might be intermittent, and that's okay for a vacation, but that's not an environment you can work in. So the demands for the type of properties has seen a substantial shift. At the same time, we're seeing record high so-called ADRs, which is average daily rates, which means that the industry is making more money than ever. I just saw the accommodation stats for 2022 for the US alone. 1/3 of all the revenue for accommodation was in short-term rentals. Hotels are only making up 2/3 of the total travel budget. And to me, that makes perfect sense. I'm working remotely from Florida this winter. Normally I live in Toronto, but we see from our data that I'm not the only one.
Yeah. So the type of landlords and the type of buildings that you see this working for, would this be more at the professional end of the host scale, who might have a whole building or half a building and a lot of kind of uniform or similar units that they can offer a company in a block booking? Is that kind of how you see it working?
It's a very fascinating industry, and we worked a lot with clients who have converted long-term rentals into short-term rentals or a part of the stock. We also work with student housing to help them, and because it's real estate, it's tied to a location. Once you have a location, you have a monopoly on that location. There's no question about it, because if someone is going somewhere, nobody else can stay there at the same time. And this is very different from the rest of the travel world. Let's say you're booking a flight, you can choose a different airline. Let's say you want, I'm going to a conference in London, I can stay at any hotel. But if I'm going for a vacation rental, I can only stay at one specific place. And this means that you can have, there's no clear big winner in the space. We had a couple of IPOs, Sonder and Vacasa last year. Their stocks have tanked because they cannot get access to a piece of real estate that maybe an owner with only one property has, or an owner with 100, or a owner with 10,000. And this is what makes it substantially different, because the customer demand is driven by a want rather than a need. And customers or consumers, they have a freedom to choose. They vote with every dollar.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Marcus. James, one of the things that is essential to make this flexible approach work in the UK, at any rate, is an understanding of it from planners. Where do you think we are with that in the UK? Does it vary a lot regionally?
Yeah, I think it does, and I think there's but I also think there's a sort of, I mean, Build to Rent has helped this cultural shift in attitudes towards housing to some extent over the last 10 years. Purpose-built student housing has probably done the same, but we're still seeing quite a lot of resistance to the concept even of co-living or shared living products, much of which when you drill into that and interrogate people about why they are anxious about this type of accommodation, it is unfounded. I think there is a fundamental mismatch actually between the needs of a modern society and a modern economy, and the types of employment and types of needs that spring from that, and a housing policy, which is certainly in the UK, and I know that's similar in other countries, that assumes that that success of a place means that people come to live somewhere kind of for the rest of their lives, for want of a better phrase. That's how the planning authorities think that they need to provide homes for people for the long term and only the long term, and anything that's shorter than that is not contributing to the community, is not really helping people, or at worst fobbing people off with a substandard product. And I'm just sort of vocalizing some of the myths and anxieties here that I've come across. A lot of that is fundamentally wrong and misunderstands the nature of modern society. So I think what we as a sector kind of need to do, and this is something I'm particularly involved with, and particularly in London as well, which is a major global city, which seems to largely think you can sort of have for sale housing and affordable housing, and that's kind of all the housing you need, and anything else is it's not really quite up to scratch for some reason, although there's a desperate need for demand. So I suppose part of the challenge for us is to gather data, demonstrate that level of demand, and also demonstrate through resident or customer satisfaction surveys that people are really happy with this type of thing, and then make sure that buildings, and particularly these sort of multi-use buildings, multi-tenure buildings, contribute to the wider community in which they sit, and not just to the residents within their four walls. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this, which is not helpful. But we've got to find a sort of a sector-wide strategy that addresses that.
Yeah, I find it astonishing actually that co-living is so misunderstood generally by planners, and you only have to look across to Ireland to see how bad it can get, where there's a complete moratorium on co-living planning consents now, based on one or two bad examples where people, to use your phrase, were being fobbed off with small and substandard units. It has happened, but completely altered a use class in its tracks because of a couple of bad examples seems quite short-sighted to me.
And I think anyone who's actively developing into this sector is doing that with a long-term attitude and an intention to provide good quality accommodation. It may be compact, it may be small, it may be intended for people for a relatively short time compared to people in other tenure groups, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing or it's not wanted. And the people who use that type of accommodation are generally very happy with that for that period of their lives.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see now that a lot of the same institutional investors who have really powered build to rent over the last decade or so coming into co-living now. So hopefully that will be the solution to give it the impetus it needs. Going back to planning, John, you mentioned earlier that you, according to demand, you might slightly tweak your ratio of build to rent and serviced apartment properties. Is that an issue with planning? Because obviously they have different planning use classes. Is that a tricky, complex thing to do, or fairly straightforward?
Yes, it is fairly difficult. However, if we go back to an earlier point that James made, if we try to manage it as best we can, we hit the 90-day rule, which you can with corporate service departments, then you certainly can overcome that because you fall within the brackets of the allowable stays. Should you drop below that, and a point to make here is obviously we don't have contracts with our guests and so forth, much as you have with the BTR. So there's no fixed contract. Somebody could come in for a 6-month stay and complete the work in 6 weeks and be pulled out of the building, and it could be 10 clients, say, for argument's sake, and then you've failed on the 90-day ruling. However, by and large, we do tend to manage our stays longer than that. So over the period that we can stay for 90 days or less, technically speaking, you could have 91-day stays, 91-day stays as such, or one evening stays, and then you've surpassed your rule for the, or you surpassed your quota for the year. However, if we can manage it with the longer stays, and that's how we overcome this, we try and encourage longer stays and extend the stays, and thereby overcoming the fact that we have to have, various class rules and so forth. Some of our buildings are C1, which you can manage that on, which is quite easily done. But the majority of our buildings will be C3. And we just have to try and our very best to manage that process by virtue of creating longer stays. And that goes back to creating comfortable stays, get a good service, guest services, a responsive guest services, providing the comforts that they would expect at a home stroke hotel level, along with slightly more than that, i.e. you've got a kitchen, you can do your own, washing, or you can do your own cooking and so forth. So it overcomes that by the virtue of, as I said, by just creating longer stays, which results in overcoming the permissions.
Yeah, okay. And John, when it comes down to the physical product, how different are the build-to-rent units to the service department units, or are they broadly similar?
I would say they're broadly similar. One of the things that's come across to us lately, as obviously the work from home still is prevalent. I have found, though, from a year ago, or not a year ago, let's go back to last year this time, virtually everybody that was coming in for an interview, whether it be, there was A2 at the time, A2D, the first question was, well, how many times a week would I need to come into the office? There was sort of it wasn't about the salary or about anything else. It was how many times did I need to come into the office? That has changed slightly from the point, even before I left there and came here, it had already changed there. People were willing to come in 4 days a week or 3 days a week. And now it's, 4 days and 5 days. I mean, I myself am in literally 5 days a week for the work environment, especially in what we do. We need to tend to be, and this doesn't go across all roles, marketing, for argument's sake, can work off site a bit more than sales. I've always been involved in sales or, acquisitions and so forth. So whether I'm in the office or out of the office, that has changed. I'm back at work, and I think I see that around me by traveling into London every day. I live out in Rickmansworth, traveling into London every day. The traffic, at 6:30 in the morning is as bad as it is at 8:30 in the morning, as are the tubes. So that's the biggest thing that I would say. However, that applies to both sectors. That applies to BTR as much as to service departments, because coming in for 3 months, they're going to want to work from home some days because they've been brought over here from the States or from other parts of the country, or whatever the case might be. So yeah, the design is very, very slight. You need to give both of those sets of people the same amenities as would required, whether it be, although service departments can have self-check-in, BTR would like a concierge or guest services.
Yeah,
those are the slight differences that you would provide. But then if you got them in the same building, the service departments will benefit from the fact that you have a guest services at a desk, or let's call it a concierge.
so although you've got separate floors, you wouldn't have separate entrances or anything. It would all.
Oh, no, definitely. The separate floors is just to, because some of the challenges and the opportunities are great. You can diversify your tenure, you can diversify your income, you can react to the shared ownership income a lot quicker than you can to the BTR income. You have greater control, though, of a BTR. Again, that's your stable income, and then you've got the risk and reward income, which is the shared ownership. And just as an example, if I may share with yourself and my colleagues on the call and the wider audience, we're looking at a recent block at the moment of approximately 80 apartments, and we've taken the 80-20 rule. If we were fully let at 100% of BTR, and we go with an 80-20, so we take the 80% of the BTR units, and give 20%, which is 16 units, to shared ownership. And we say that the 80% of the BTR is also fully let, but we only run at 70% capacity on the service department units. We would increase the income stream by 17%.
Mm-hmm.
That's a massive. So take 100% let BTR, 80% at 100% let, and 20% at 70% occupancy. We would increase that stream by 17%. So is there a risk and reward? Of course there is. And the reward seems to be the bigger R of the two at the moment because of the demand.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, John. Marcus, did you want to pick up on something that John touched on there?
Yeah. I wanted to mention that since we work with a lot of large clients, we about 20%, 25% of our staff is actually dedicated to helping our customers become successful. And although we provide the software, what they quite often end up needing is, of course, business advice, because they typically are someone who's doing long-term rentals, let's say student accommodation, or they own entire apartment buildings, and they want to get into the space. And when we talk about things like unit design, or whether it should be furnished or how to furnish it, I can say that's not the biggest challenge, because we work to help these clients to understand what it takes to be really successful. But the biggest problem that I have seen is actually in the attitude of the organization. And I think it's because while on the surface that it's an identical product, you know, you walk into a home and it's a home. It has a sofa, it has a TV, it has a bed, it has a bathroom. It's actually, you're actually selling two completely different products. One of them is a commodity. It's something that everyone needs. It's a bit like a grocery store. You want to buy milk, you go to the grocery store, you buy your milk in the morning. If it's not there, you go to another store. If it has a certain price, it doesn't really matter. That's a commodity. And that's what long-term living is like. A student that comes in from far away from home, they need to sleep somewhere, and they're buying a commodity. And that's a need that people have, the need for shelter. However, when we're talking about short-term rentals, that's not a need, that's a want. That's like a high-end restaurant. It's not something that anyone needs. It's something that people choose to do. And the challenge with that is that you are pre-selling them an experience. So first of all, I see long-term rentals as a product. You're selling them, for example, an apartment or a house to stay in. But short-term rentals is a service. And that means that if your organization is used to selling a product or building a product or brokering a product, you're going to have extremely big difficulties entering the short-term rental market, because every staff member that you have is focused on that product, while actually what the customers are buying is a service. And that's a shift that I've seen, and this especially once you have over 100 staff members, it's almost impossible to change that, because the organization is too big. It's much easier if you have, let's say, 20 staff members in your company. You will be able to change the culture and get people to accept that you're selling a service here, and you need to deliver on the service. But with bigger organizations, they end up failing quite many times, and they always think it was something with the money, or it was something about the style of properties, or something wrong with the demand, but data doesn't show that.
It's an interesting point, and on a related subject, we have seen quite a lot here that operators of longer term real estate in the living space, so in build to rent, in co-living and senior living, they've been hiring quite a lot of people with a hospitality background to try and address that, and to provide things like programming, trying to foster a sense of community and this kind of stuff. So I think the good operators are aware of that, and they're definitely trying to address it.
That's very true. For example, a university in Montreal approached us. They said we got I think it was 700 rooms that are all available in the summer, and summer is the top tourism season. They wanted to monetize that, and eventually, as we spoke to them, it became clear to them and to us that they won't be able to run it. They just won't. But we were fortunate enough to be able to introduce them to one of our customers who was able to take on the full operating responsibility, which of course lowered their margins. But if it's physically impossible for someone to operate something, I would recommend get someone who's a professional involved in doing that. Even though your main job might be operating long-term rentals, operating short-term rentals is just a different business model.
Yeah. John, did you want to come in there?
Hi, yes. George, yeah, absolutely, Marcus. Thank you for that. It's quite right. The design of the units are going to be very similar, but that's the answer I was relating to earlier. I don't find much difference in the design of the units in the one that we're currently launching on the 8th. But certainly the service levels are totally different with regards to our sort of service department customers as opposed to our BTR customers. They tend to be home from home. That is their home. They make it their home and they live in that sort of space. Whereas the other side of the business is they're coming in for a very short term. They're going to be a lot more picky and choosy, if I may use those words, from the position that they can go somewhere else at the drop of a hat. they're not signed into a contract, their business, the companies can go somewhere else. So certainly there are other benefits given to them, or greater, for the want of a better word, a lot greater care, a lot more hand-holding. However, when we have a mixed tenure, I think both parties benefit equally from that relationship. The one that we give the BTR relationships, let's talk about the guest services, the shared ownership benefits from that, and from the greater care and demand that we have on hand for our service department customers, the BTR will benefit from that again. So there's a lot of cross-beneficial work going on in the background. And I think the mixed tenure, which is the way we see going forward, is definitely helping both sides.
Yeah, okay, thanks, John. Tom, are you seeing any operational challenges in serving the different audiences that you have in your properties, or is it simplified in your case because there's such a demarcation in the calendar between one type of customer and another, or do you cater for both groups at the same time?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to cater for both groups at the same time. As I mentioned previously, students do stay with us over the summer. And it's not that, the summer rolls around and they all check out. You have postgraduates, you have nurses, they require 51-week contracts, which last the whole year into the summer.
Yeah.
Not only that, but even some of our summer clientele who come and stay with us, especially in London properties, are often language schools, and they can vary in age ranges, be language schools or for other means of coming here as a summer school. And yeah, it really is an operational kind of project to make sure that we are right from the off, not just in the lead up to summer, but we're talking 2 years prior, really, because we start selling rooms for given the check-ins for September 2023. That's going to influence the summer of 2024 by means of who's staying where in the building. And we've started selling since the November that's just gone of last year. So that's a 2-year project, really, where we need to make sure all 51 weekers, for instance, are booking in the same place. All 43 weekers are booking in the same in a different area, which we then anticipate to open up over the summer months, so that we can fill that with the different clientele. Not to mention those who are staying 51 weeks. They're still studying, or if they're nurses, they're going to be on shifts and such. So you don't really want to mix them, I suppose, with that hotel style guest who are staying here for leisure, who may be, obviously here to relax, maybe to enjoy themselves, and we don't want that disruption. So especially, you would never mix in flats. And we also, definitely try and keep them in their own separate floors, and where the kind of the building setup will allow different blocks, if we can do that. So yeah, it's definitely something we consider and have to get right if we're going to satisfy both our long-term business of the students in the building, but also, as Marcus rightly touched upon, that service element as well. The hotel guests are looking for something different. Yes, we are. I suppose when they're staying with us, it might have a very serviced apartment feel, especially if it's a studio room in the middle of London. But we need to make sure that the inclusions are correct. We need to make sure that if the level of service on site, like they understand the different customer base, because yes, service, no matter what, if you're staying for long term or short term, is important. But especially with students, there's a different approach to a good level of service as what is kind of expected. There's a lot more of a custodial side of things for students, whereas in hotel guests, it's a very much, I think, more of a attentive thing. So Marcus is right with that education, making sure everyone's comfortable, understand where the different guests are staying. And yeah, that's where these external service providers can really help us understand what the room should be made up to look like, but also how to treat them. And they can also deal with certain things as well, like the turnarounds and the complaints or any other issues that may come about. Yeah.
And Tom, can you just touch a bit on how technology has kind of evolved to enable you to run what is become a more complicated business by virtue of having different audiences, different tenures, different lengths of stay, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it's been essential, really. Not just with our own management of that. As I mentioned, we do have a property in Coventry. It is where we do these short-term rentals all year round for students, obviously, but still, they'll be short-term. And now that we have, the technological setup to be able for the student to choose their dates of stay, the tenancy agreement will be, flexed to suit those dates. The charges will be as such. It's, worlds apart from what back in the day we used to have to do, and it would be very much a manual process when there was an online portal. So it means the volume we can definitely do in-house, but also outside of anything less than the as I said, the timeframes, we can really manage about 29 days minimum, really, with the on-site resource to turn around the rooms and just to manage, to be honest with you, administratively. But with the external service provider, they can really reduce that. The technology they use, as I say, it's not worth our investment so much to buy that technology or hire someone to always monitor, you know, what the market's saying by the short-term rental charges. So we have you know, Lavanda who do that for us. They, you know, make sure we're getting the best rate possible for those rooms based on the product that we have and the service we're offering. But they also manage the actual the turnarounds and stuff for us as well between guests and deal with the kind of pre-arrival stuff, all that business. So that is all technology that they are using to manage those stays, kind of remote from the property. And yeah, it definitely has opened up that world to us.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tom. Marcus, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I wanted to comment a bit on the shared spaces or having both long-term and short-term stays in the same place, because it's something that causes a lot of conflict, and it's also a large reason why short-term rentals have often been outlawed in certain areas. And there's a very simple rule that you can follow to evaluate that, and that's by looking at the price point. So if you go into a neighborhood and you buy really low income housing, and then you put long-term and short-term rental guests together, you're going to have a bad time. It's that simple. However, if you are looking, I actually lived long-term in a building in downtown Helsinki for a year, and most of the neighbors, they weren't living there full time. They were business people, sports celebrities, and they were using it as a pied-à-terre. They came into the city and stayed there. In the same building, there were short-term rentals, and now I stay in that building whenever I visit Helsinki. That's not a problem, but it's a question about price point. So if it's high price point, there's going to be less of a problem mixing these, because the people that can afford a high price point, they tend to travel more than the people who do not afford that. And it's one mistake that I see especially in markets that have a lot of tourism. One mistake that people do when they try to make these decisions is they look at the price point rather than looking at how is it relative to other properties in the building. So let's say in London, you can find an extremely expensive long-term rental in a terrible area, in terrible shape. And if you're thinking that's a luxury stay, you're wrong. Just because the price is high doesn't mean that anyone is going to have a good time if you mix long-term and short-term. But then again, if you're in London, if you take something that's 3 times the price of average, it can actually work out really well, because what you'll find out is that even the long-term renters there, they don't stay there. They stay there a couple of weeks a year. They just rent it for the full year.
Yeah. Thanks, Marcus. James, I want to ask you about a topic that I'm quite interested in, which I think is starting to gain a bit of momentum now. And this is about how operators can retain their customers through various stages of their lives. And I think there are people out there with the scope of the Greystars and such of this world who must be thinking about people going from student living to co-living to build to rent to senior living, and attempting to retain those customers through all those different life stages. Is this something that you're seeing gaining traction? And do you think it's possible to do 2 or more of those life stages in the same development if it's big enough?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting subject, because I think people assume that the delay in average age for home purchase, for example, for home ownership, is solely about affordability, and that is a factor, and it's probably a fairly significant one, but it's certainly not the only factor. And the other factors that come in are an absolute demand for flexibility in various stages of people's lives, and again, probably generally at the younger end, but not exclusively, because people's lives take, you know, not a non-linear path, and there are, you know, people have changes of geography or household makeup, and various things happen to people, so they need that flexibility at different points in their lives. So I think that's sort of the background of it. I think the several things to say on this. I think, and I'm certainly not, you know, I can't claim to be a spokesman for Greystar anymore, but you know, that type of accommodation or that type of operator who have, you know, have feet in various camps, you can get a sort of a brand loyalty where you're living in one building that's managed by that operator, and you think, I've had a really good experience here. This has been good quality accommodation, and the management team were great. I've got to move to another city for whatever length of time, for either for my work or for personal reasons. Oh, they've got a building there. I know what I'm going to get. It's just the most straightforward thing to do, and I'll go there. And I can see that happening. And you know, Greystar, along with others, have a student housing brand, and we found that a lot of the students, when they came to the end of their degree courses and were no longer full-time students and were therefore no longer eligible to live in that building, they were saying, can we please stay on? We said, well, sorry, you're just not allowed to, because that's the sort of the conditions under which we operate this property. And you know, but here we've now got some built to rent stuff, which is similar in its principle, but it's a different style of accommodation, a different type of community, and you'd be very welcome to come to one of our buildings. And a lot of people are really grateful for that. And in the early days, you know, sort of, you know, 10 years ago, or maybe not quite that long ago, but you know, several years ago, there wasn't that opportunity, certainly in a place like London, because those, you know, purpose-built general rental buildings had not been developed yet. So, but I can see that bit. So that principle is now that you can move from one to the other, and if we can incorporate 2 or 3 of these in the same building, that would be great. I think just to come back on the previous conversation a little bit, I think when you've got separate floors and separate uses within the building, I think one of the key success factors in that is communication to all of your residents. So when people are coming into the building, being very open and transparent about the fact that there are other types of accommodation and housing in the building, so that people are not surprised by that later. I mean, and it's one of the reasons for keeping separate floors, even though the apartments may be exactly the same, the access arrangements may be exactly the same, but to have a long-term resident there next to an apartment that's changing every, you know, over very frequently is not comfortable for them. And if they don't know about that in advance, they would be very upset about it. But you know, being transparent about it up front helps that to work better. So yeah, well, I've rolled a few things into one there, but yeah, I think, yeah, just I think for all of us, it's just, you know, understanding what modern life throws up in terms of people's needs and actually responding to that. I think the other thing is there's a danger here that we're saying, yes, of course, these have got to be successful businesses and they've got to make money. I think looking at it from a planning perspective, in terms of persuading planning authorities to allow you to build these sort of buildings, I think we probably should not emphasize the fact, you know, I think the fact that you might get a higher rate for a certain type of accommodation is a byproduct of that type of accommodation. It shouldn't be the driving factor. The driving factor should be, we're responding to a need which is out there for this city and in this place to actually work properly as a society.
Yeah. Going back to the first part of your answer, James, I cite this example fairly often. We toured a property in Paris last year as part of our Recharge event. It was, I think it's Europe's biggest student accommodation building. And the amenities there are unbelievable. It had a gaming room, it had a music room, which you would have loved, Marcus, complete with full set of brand new instruments, bass guitar, drum kit, and all this stuff. Is incredible. But the age range of people living there was from 17 to 70, which was quite astonishing. And also hearing anecdotally that there are quite a lot of people living in co-living developments in London who are in their 50s, who might stay there for 6 months or a year between one property and another. So it's not always as predictable as you might think who's going to stay where. We're nearly running out of time, but we've got some good questions here, so I want to crack through some of these quickly. James, I just want to stay with you for a minute for the first one. Does flexible use have any impact on the need for shared spaces within properties, such as workspace, gym, etc.?
In principle, no, but I think it comes back to that transparency and communication, just making sure that people are aware that other users are in the building, and and I think as long as people are aware of that, that should be okay. It enables you to manage it well. But those, in principle, those facilities should be available to everyone who's resident in the building. Yeah.
Mark's hand went up like a shot there, so I think he might have a different point of view.
Yeah, I think it's very important here to separate two entirely different worlds. It reminds these amenities. It reminds me a lot of how companies used to advertise having ping pong tables and good coffee and pizza and free beer, when actually they were paying terrible salaries and had terrible working conditions. It makes a huge difference on whether the people want to live there or want to stay there, or whether they are forced to stay there. If you have people who are forced to stay there because they have nowhere else to go, putting in a ping pong table is almost like an insult. It's I mean, it's nice, but if the rest of the place is in terrible shape, that's just it will feel like an insult. On the other hand, on the upper end of things, you will need these things, because otherwise you won't be upper end anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Marcus. James, there's another one here which I think maybe is one for you. Lionel Igodaro says local authorities are one of the biggest landlords in the UK with access to sites, land, and unused buildings. Do you think they should be looking to be a bit more innovative and start developing co-living properties or other use classes for I know that there is a new wave of council housing starting, not on the scale that we used to do it before, but do you think local authorities should be mixing it up a bit?
Well, yeah, they probably should be, but whether they will or not is a completely different matter. I think there are good examples of joint venture arrangements coming up. I think they wouldn't necessarily do it on their own, but I think there are many local authorities out there with and other public sector organisations such as health trusts and that sort of thing with spare land, which they are looking to both accommodate some of their own employees and staff, perhaps, but also bring in some an income stream, or a share in an income stream, rather than just sell off a plot of land as a one-off transaction. So I think there is scope in that, and I think in terms of the specifics of co-living, I think that's probably, it's the local authorities where we're seeing the largest resistance to this at the moment. So I think there's a good deal of education and data and evidence to come before we get to that point of them being enthusiastic about it. But yes, I think they should. Yeah. They should certainly talk about it.
John, did you want to comment on that quickly? We've got about a minute left.
Very quickly, yeah. I'll just support what James said. Working with the AXO Housing Association, there was certainly a lot of let's call it joint ventures with councils, and they would have a lot of input with regards to the 106. Obviously, there would be shared ownership in there, but then the more progressive ones were certainly linking up with A2D and going, along with what is the trend at the moment. So that is certainly being picked up.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. That was a really interesting discussion. We just want to show a few more slides before we wrap up. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes with a countdown clock, so you can take some notes from all the good stuff that's been posted in the chat. So our next Urban Living webinar is on the 1st of March, and the title is Where Are Institutional Investors Deploying Their Money? And I think in the last 2 or 3 months, there has been quite a shift in where this is going, particularly in the living sector. So that's going to be an interesting chat. There should be a link for you to register for that in the chat. A quick plug for our flagship event, which is taking place at Canary Wharf in July, the Urban Living Festival. Again, there's more info in the chat, but this is a really great event which focuses around the convergence of asset classes across real estate and hospitality. Just like to introduce Stephanie, who is our new VP of Sales here at IHM. Her contact details are also in the chat, so if you'd like to find out more about what we do, then drop Steph a line. Or our other colleague Katie, who is a Global Partnerships Manager. Again, you can see her details there and in the chat. So thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks to James, Marcus, John and Tom for your insight today. Really good stuff. Really enjoyed the chat. Thank you to you all for watching. If you're on any of the social channels that you can see there, then give us a follow. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on March the 1st for the next one, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone.